My name is Amamsa. My mother died and my father left. I miss my mom.
Commercials similar to this one are shown across the United States in order to fund much-needed developments in impoverished nations in Africa. This is a major dilemma. The generalization of Africa has led to the misconception that all of continental Africa is war-torn and in despair. A lack of knowledge, inaccurate information provided by media, and differing, sometimes selfish, incentives lead to a misunderstanding of aid and a lack of progress where it is desperately needed. But to develop alternative solutions and bring about sustainable economic change, one must understand aid and its history in Africa.
Aid to Africa can be traced back to the 1950s when the concept of the Bretton Woods Conference, which successfully reconstructed post-World War II Europe through the use of aid, was applied to many developing countries, especially in Africa, in the hopes of helping these nations industrialize.
The aid given to Africa comes in many different forms. Emergency relief, monetary donations, workers, and military equipment all fall under the category of donations to Africa. But the question is, are all of these beneficial?
Aid is supposed to help people to be much more self-sufficient. So good aid or positive aid would be aid that has a distinct timeline, that doesn't run off forever, aid that actually results in lifting people out of poverty, right? And aid that helps people to be self-sufficient.
Aid coming from Western nations in the 1960s was aimed at infrastructure projects which could help facilitate economic development. Later, we learned that many of these projects become obsolete, simply because of the lack of economic opportunity. For example, a bridge is useless if no exports are crossing it. Also, during this time, the United States was competing with the Soviet Union to increase aid to countries such as independent Guinea.
Right, so negative aid typically would be aid that ends up breeding corruption in African countries, right? Aid that doesn't get to the people, and that is true, right? But also negative aid, one might argue, is also aid that ends up staying in the United States disproportionately. What do I mean by that? Out of the money given for aid to Africa for some of those food products stays in the United States to farmers, to lobbyists.
In the 1970s, funding to impoverished African countries began to focus less on development and more on immediate poverty-related needs, such as food. This was due to rising oil prices, which inevitably caused food and commodity prices to skyrocket as well.
Following the oil crisis of 1979, much-needed aid to Africa increased drastically. This did not only help those living in poverty, but had domestic benefits too. Again, Cold War-motivated aid was given by the U.S. with the goal of implementing a capitalist policy in quote-unquote third world countries.
I also want to say that it is important for us to note that over the last 50 years, Africa has been receiving increasing aid from the international community in form of technical assistance and financial aid and all other forms of aid. Between 1960 and 2003, our continent received $600 billion of aid, and we are still told that there is a lot of poverty in Africa. Where has all the aid gone?
In the 1990s, when the international community began to recognize the ineffectiveness of aid, they blamed it on incompetent and corrupt African governments. So then aid shifted to the brigade of governmental reform.
Well, aid dependency, first of all, is the big one, right? It kind of breeds a cycle of which people just expect aid to bail them out, right? So they end up not even trying to live within their means. Aid could be bad when it makes people complacent, right? It makes government not accountable to their citizens. It also have all the bad consequences by not being effective. So, for example, if you have families that live in chronic poverty, right? As long as aid targeted to those families, right, is not effective, they would continue to reproduce poverty for several generations. Although also the obvious thing in which aid becomes almost like a celebrity cause that attracts a lot of bonos, a lot of other celebrities, that while useful, could distract from what actually aid is supposed to be.
In the new millennium, aid to Africa can be defined by a noticeable commercialization led by numerous forms of media and often promoted by celebrities such as Bono, Angelina Jolie, and Brad Pitt.
But I want to say that there are two things we need to connect: how the media covers Africa in the West and the consequences of that by displaying despair, helplessness, and hopelessness. The media is telling the truth about Africa and nothing but the truth. However, the media is not telling us the whole truth, because despair, civil war, hunger, and famine, although they are part and parcel of our African reality, they are not the only reality, and secondly, they are the smallest reality. Africa has 53 nations. We have civil wars only in 6 countries, which means that the media are covering only 6 countries. Africa has immense opportunities that never navigate through the web of despair and helplessness that the Western media largely presents to its audience.
Although aid is often fueled by good intentions, its outcome is often problematic for the community when the incentive to fiscally grow and sustain is not distinguished. Aid cripples Africa and fosters dependency. Why bother to build a well-governed state and a dynamic economy with a local tax base when revenues can be acquired much more easily from abroad?
Kibera, the largest slum in East Africa, located in Nairobi, is in need of innovative development. The CDC, USAID, and several small nonprofit organizations are working to help the community. With an unknown population and HIV/AIDS infecting a large percentage of that population, many organizations are doing what they can to try to help the community. Some organizations are providing assistance to those who are HIV positive without educating on how to stop the spread of the disease. When I was in Kibera, I was told of a program that the USAID runs where they provide food and medicine for a child with HIV/AIDS and their family. While this is not a sustainable program because it is based off of donations alone, it has also turned tragic. There were instances when families have intentionally infected one of their children with HIV/AIDS in order to reap the benefits of the program. This is an example of aid not being implemented properly. It is crucial that incentives change to move away from the idea of handouts and toward entrepreneurial strategies to end poverty.
Aid is controversial because the outcomes are not always established sustainably. In order to eradicate poverty, people must become more informed about aid, media's portrayal of Africa must be diversified, and the overall catalyst and goal must change. This change will come with inventive, viable solutions to poverty.